Good. All right, Judges chapter number 1. Last Wednesday night, raise your hand if you were here last Wednesday night. Last Wednesday night we looked at the tribe of Judah, the nation of Israel, and how they came and they fought for Jerusalem. And that is one of the most iconic cities in the Bible. It is, when you think of Israel and you think of Jews, you immediately think of Jerusalem. That was God's chosen city. And we went through all the Old Testament and the New Testament and showed how important that place is to God. And that was what we talked about, was the most in Israel's life as a nation. That was their most used victory. And we looked at how rough and how ugly that fight was. And I tried my best to just encourage these ugly fights that we fight against in sin and fighting against the things of the world and against the flesh. Judges chapter 1, I want to start reading in verse number 19. Judges 1, verse number 19. Mason, where's my ball, son? Did you get my ball? I'll throw it at you. Oh, here it is. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. All right. All right, make sure we're all awake and on the same page. All right, Judges 1, verse number 19. And the Lord was with Judah, and he drave out the inhabitants of the mountain, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had chariots of iron. And they gave Hebron unto Caleb, as Moses said, and he expelled thence the 3 sons of Anak. And the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites that inhabited Jerusalem, but the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem unto this day. Look down in verse number 27. Neither did Manasseh drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and her towns, nor Tanakh and her towns, nor the inhabitants of Dor and her towns, nor the inhabitants of Ibleam and her towns, nor the inhabitants of Megiddo and her towns. But, they about didn't beat nobody. They just kind of moved in with everybody else. But the Canaanites would dwell in that land. And it came to pass, when Israel was strong, that they put the Canaanites to tribute and did not utterly drive them out. Neither did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites that dwell in Gezer, but the Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them. Neither did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, nor the inhabitants of Nahilol, but the Canaanites dwelt among them and became tributaries, meaning they paid taxes to them. Neither did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Acco, nor the inhabitants of Zidon, nor of Elam, nor of all those other places. But the Asherites dwelt among the Canaanites and the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Neither did Naphtali drive out the inhabitants of Bethshemesh, nor the inhabitants of Bethanath, but he dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Bethshemesh and Bethanath became tributaries unto them, and the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountain, for they would not suffer them to come down to the valley. The book of Judges, if you're familiar with how the Old Testament lays out, Israel was in bondage to Egypt for how long? 400 years. And then God raised up a very important man, and his name was Moses. And Moses came and he told Pharaoh, God said, let my people go. Of course, that enraged Pharaoh. And God and Pharaoh got into a match. God sent plague after plague after plague to basically just wipe Egypt out, until Pharaoh finally gave up and said, okay, Israel, you can leave. And as Israel's leaving, Pharaoh changes his mind, and he just in a rage and in a fit gets all of his army together, and they chase Israel all the way to the Red Sea. God parts the Red Sea. Israel walks across on dry ground. Pharaoh and his belligerent army come barging in after them, and then God puts the water back, and they all drown and die. And Israel goes around in Egypt, or in the wilderness, for 40 years, trying to get to what's called the Promised Land. God had made a promise centuries before to Abraham. He sent Abraham to Canaan. He said, this is going to be your people's land. This nation will be yours. And so God sent Israel, and they went through the wilderness for 40 years. Well, they finally got to the Promised Land. Moses dies. Joshua takes his place as the leader of the nation. And the whole entire book of Joshua, which leads up to Judges, is Joshua leading them into battle after battle after battle to win the promised land and drive out all these people and make what was supposed to be theirs, theirs. Well, Joshua is old. In Joshua chapter 2, actually the details of it, he passes away. And so the nation of Israel is supposed to continue on and get these inhabitants out of the land and make this promised land theirs. They're supposed to be a nation of victory. But as we just read, they come in and they fight all these people, but they don't really win. It's kind of end in a tie. And one after the other, you've got Judah. They could not drive them out. The children of Benjamin did not drive them out. And then you just got neither did Manasseh, neither did Ephraim, neither did Zebulun, neither did Asher, neither did Naphtali. And so you've got a nation of neithers. They neither own it nor don't own it. They're not in complete victory. They're just kind of like in a tie. We had a ball game the other day, and we should have won. This is baseball, and it shouldn't mean that much. But when you're winning 8-1 in the last half inning, it means a lot. Them little suckers come back. They scored 7 runs, and the game ended in a tie. You know what the head coach said at the huddle? He said, I just want y'all to know we did not win today. All we got was a tie. We neither won nor lost. And as Israel comes into the promised land and Joshua passes on, they neither really win nor lose. And the one nation under God turned from the God they were under. And Judges is really a sad story of just what could have been. If you're familiar with the book of Judges at all, Israel goes through this vicious cycle. And they in chapter 2, I'll show you in chapter 2, verse number 11, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served Balaam, and they forsook the Lord God of their fathers. And so they went through this cycle of forsaking God and worshiping other gods. And then the judgment of God would fall. And the Philistines or someone else would come in and fight against them and take them as hostages, make them start paying tribute, and just make their life miserable. Well, then they would feel bad for forsaking God, and they would realize that praying to and sacrificing to is really just a hunk of junk and can't hear my prayer, and I realize that I'm a fool, and they would start praying and asking God for help. So you know what God would do? God would help. God would help, and He would raise up a judge. If you'll look in chapter 2 and verse number 16. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them. They would not hearken unto their judges, but they turned quickly out of the way which their fathers walked in, obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not so. And when the Lord raised them up judges, then the Lord was the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. And so Israel was going through the cycle. They would forsake God, they would be punished by God, they would pray to God, God would help them, everything would be fine for a minute, and then as soon as that judge died, like Samson or Gideon or Deborah or so on, as soon as that judge passed on, they went right back to forsaking God and worshiping other gods, and it was just this vicious cycle. The book of Judges, if you can turn to the very last chapter and look at the way the book ends, it's a great commentary on America, honestly, but Judges 21, verse 25, says, In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. It's a sad commentary for a nation that's supposed to know God. And it ends in chapter 21, verse number 25, but it started in chapter 1 with all these neithers. Israel had known the presence of God. If you look in chapter 1 and verse 19, the Bible says the Lord was with Judah. The Lord was with Judah. God was helping Judah fight. God was helping in these battles. In verse number 22, it says the house of Joseph, they went also up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. The Lord was with Joseph. They knew the presence of God. They knew God. We looked last week at some of the miracles that God wrought in these battles, and how God stopped the sun and the moon, and how God rained hailstones, God sent hornets, and God did all sorts of things to help Israel win these battles. But now they're going to have to learn the patience of God, because they have fallen short of the victories that God had planned for them to have. And though they the land, they had not won the land. Though they were in the promised land, they never really got complete victory. And I want to talk about these Niethers. And every single, I don't know if you've picked up what I'm trying to lay down, but in all of our lives there are things that sometimes we just never get victory over. And I'm not saying this because you're not saved. Israel was in the promised land. They were where God wanted them to be. But sadly, a lot of times we never really become all that God wanted us to be. And there's a lot of fights in the flesh that we never really get the victory of. There's a lot of sin we never really stop. There's a lot of things that we never really become for the glory of God because of these Niethers. Now, I want to say this about the nation of Israel. Israel had always been the underdog. From its very inception, when Joseph went down to Egypt, we got a slave, and then, rags to riches. Then his family comes in. Y'all remember this in the end of Genesis. And the Egyptians said, well, y'all are shepherds. Those are an abomination. Y'all live in Goshen. They wouldn't even eat together. And then there arose a king that knew not Joseph. All that generation died, and they made the Israelites, they made the Jews, they made them slaves. And for 400 plus years they were slaves. When they finally got out of Egypt and they finally got away, they were just almost like a gypsy nation, just kind of bouncing around the wilderness for 40 years. And for their entire existence, it's always been someone else's fault. It was always, and then throughout the wilderness, it was all those other nations' fault. But now, as they've come into their own land, and they now have their own failures, it's just their fault. They have fully learned the grace of God. I mean, the Red Sea was the grace of God. The Passover was the grace of God. That manna falling out of heaven every day was the grace of God. The quail coming up and falling over dead was the grace of God. The cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, that was the grace of God. Giving them Moses, that was the grace of God. The rock that followed them, that river that followed them through the wilderness, they would have water, that was the grace of God. They had fully learned what grace was. Now they got to learn what guilt is. They have to learn that I didn't win, and it's not God's fault, and it's not Canaan's fault, and it ain't Moses' fault, and it ain't Joshua's fault, and it's not Egypt's fault, it's Judah's fault, it's Joseph's fault, and it's Manasseh's fault, and it's Ephraim's fault, and it's Zebulun's fault, and it's Asher's fault, and it's Naphtali's fault, and it's Dan's fault. They had to come to a place where they owned their circumstance. It wasn't God's fault. Would you look in verse 19? I want you to see something very interesting. The Lord was with Judah, and He drave out the inhabitants of the mountain, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had chariots of iron. Now, time I'll not go back and run the references, but God had made them a promise in Deuteronomy that when you go fight these foes, that you will win, even though they have chariots of iron. God had made them a promise that His power would be sufficient. But then they got here and they could not do it. Now, would you look in verse 19? And the Lord was with Judah, and He drave out the inhabitants of the mountain. Who's the He? Is it God or Judah? Who? Because whoever the He is the same He that did the could not in the next line. Are you following me? I hope I didn't lose you. Whoever that He is, whoever that He is, brick wall or an iron shield. Earlier in the chapter, Judah was the man. They took it with the edge of the sword. Remember what took skill. They caught it, which took strategy. All right, then they burned it, and that was a statement. All right, so Judah's kind of on a roll, but Judah's met his match. And those chariots of iron stopped all victorious momentum in the entire nation. And after that little setback, it's just a one after the other of neither after neither after neither after. Added it up. 8 of the 12 tribes were neithers. Is that 75%? Is that what that is? So an overwhelming majority of the nation were neither winners nor losers. Had incomplete victory. Yeah, they got in, but they never won. And they never had complete victory. All right, so that was the could not of Judah. But look in verse number 21. And the children of Benjamin did not. They did not. On Manasseh, in verse 27, Manasseh did not. In verse number 28, they did not. Verse number 32, they did not. You see, there's a difference in what you can't do and what you won't do. Sometimes you beat your match, and there is a sin that you just, by golly, you just can't get out of. Now, I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying, from a human's perspective, you just can't quit it. But sometimes it's just you just won't quit it. Some of the neither, or most of the neither, wasn't a could not, it was a did not. They just didn't. They just didn't do it. And I'll get into why they didn't in a minute. But I want you to notice a few things about these neithers. Are y'all with me? I don't know if I got this out correctly. All right, these neithers, I want you to know, number one, that they were scheduled. All right, these fights were scheduled. God brought them out of Egypt just for these battles. All right, for sake of time, I'm not going to look at all the verses in Exodus where God told Moses, I'm going to bring you out, and then you're going to get to the promised land, and you're going to fight this ite, and this ite, and this ite, and this ite, and this ite. This went through all the ites. They were scheduled. God planned to get them there, then get them through there. God planned for these fights to happen, and then He planned for them to win. Now, I want you to look in chapter 2, please, in verse 1. Judges 2, verse 1. Now, the thought is that these neithers, these fights, were scheduled. All right, verse number 1, chapter 2. An angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochum, have brought you unto the land which I swear unto your fathers. What's this land called? The promised land. He said, I brought you to the land that I promised, that I swear to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And ye shall make no league with the inhabitants of this land. Ye shall throw down their altars. These scheduled. They were supposed to fight these fights, and they were supposed to win them. Judah was supposed to fight these chariots of iron, and Judah was supposed to win them through the power of God. Joseph was supposed to fight, and he was supposed to win through the power of God. Benjamin and Naphtali and Dan and Asher and Zebulun and Naphtali, they were supposed to fight these people, and they were supposed to win. They were supposed to have these. They were. In our lives we have not seen. Like God was expecting you to beat that sin of gossip. God was expecting you to beat that sin of lust. He was expecting you to... I knew y'all would be quiet when I started naming these things. I anticipated it though, and I brought my ball, all right? So there we go. God is expecting you to beat these things. He expects you to beat it. God scheduled it for you to conquer these particular sins. The sin of alcohol, the sin of drunkenness, the sin of lust, the sin of fornication and addiction and abuse and pride, backbiting and laziness. Laziness and laziness and laziness. God expects His children to beat those things through His Word and through His power. Scheduled. And I wonder how many victories are just really theirs. I mean, it would be like if we were reading the church roll. All right, I'm just going to use the names that are in the room. I'm not insinuating anything. I'm just start over here. Because I know Miss Tammy knows my heart and she trusts me. I was reading the church roll. We'll start in the pulpit. And Levi Wyatt, he got saved. But he could not drive out the inhabitants of such and such. He couldn't win that battle. He couldn't quit that sin. He just couldn't quit that lion. And Tammy Austin, she was saved, but she could not conquer that pride. In the family of God, but he could not drive out that lust, and he could not beat that, and so on and so forth. How many victories that God scheduled for you to have, I never won. They were scheduled. I want you to notice number two, they were specific. They were specific. Now, a common word throughout all of them, and you can go back and read it. Canaanites. Now, who were the Canaanites? Well, it's like saying, who are the Americans? Well, you got the Georgians, you got the Tennesseans, and the Floridians, and the well, I'm in the pulpit. I was going to say something about the Alabama people, but so all of these ites, these Jebusites, these Amorites, these Asherites, so on, all of these ites, they were all part of Canaan. And each tribe had to fight one. When you get to verse number 27, the tribe of Manasseh comes in. And they go to the town of Beth-shean, and they can't drive them out. Nor the town of Taanach, nor of Dor, nor of Ibleam, nor of Megiddo. They couldn't beat any of them. They just couldn't get a single spiritual victory in their whole life. They just couldn't get one. And it could be because Manasseh wasn't planning to stay. If you remember, before they ever got there, the Promised Land, try not to do too much Sunday schooling, but there were 2.5 tribes that said, we don't want to cross Jordan, we want to stay over here. And Moses said, all right, but you have to go fight. And they said, okay, we'll go fight. Isn't it weird that the one tribe that lost the most was the one that wasn't going to stay in the Promised Land anyway? But I want so then Ephraim in verse 29, they had to fight the Canaanites that were in Gezer. All right. They had to fight these folks in Kitron and these other places, and then Asher, they had their own list of places they had to fight. And the point that I'm trying to make is these neithers that we can't seem to beat. We've all got a different one. Now they're all Canaanites, but then there are all these little other ites. We've all got a ite. We've all got a ite. We've all got what I struggle with may not be what you struggle with. And what Miss Tammy struggled with may not be what Miss Jill struggled with. We all got an ite. Or like Manasseh, we might have a list of ites. I mean, it might be like a book of ites. We just got all these ites we can't beat in life. It was specific. They all lost to a different ite. All right, now I want you to see this third thing. These neithers, they were scheduled, they were specific, but I want you to notice how they settled. If you look at verse 28, it came to pass. Are y'all still with me? Talking about a nation of neithers. It came to pass that Israel was Canaanites to say the word? And you will find that throughout this list, while they make people tributary. So what does that mean? Right? That means they come into the land, they fought a war, and they kind of didn't. They didn't drive them out. So they said, we're not leaving, and you're going to have to pay us. They kind of asserted dominance over them, and they said, you're going to have to pay us taxes. We're going to tax your wheat. We're going to tax your corn. You're going to have to pay tax your gold. We're going to tax everything. You're going to start paying us money. You're going to kind of serve us. It's kind of how they made this deal, and they negotiated. And as I already noted, that there were 8 of the 12 become Niethers, so and everybody was making a negotiation. Instead of fighting and just killing you all and getting you all out of here, we'll just make a deal. I won't kill you, but you're going to have to start paying me money. Is that making sense? What happened? So, because everyone else in Israel was settling, because of a financial benefit, it became very easy to just be comfortable with being a Niether. It was just a lot simpler to just don't kill everybody, just kind of move in and just make them pay you and just make peace with them. It's very diplomatic. It's very civil. It's very, noble. Very absolutely against what God told them to do. So they settled. And as you survey Christianity in America, most Christians, they just settle. Number one, does. I don't want to be the only guy in my family against this stuff. Like, I don't want my kid getting made fun of because I don't let them play this or watch this when everyone else does. I don't want my kid looking weird at school because they're the only one that won't wear. I don't want people to look at me weird at work because I don't talk this way. That's what everyone else is doing. I don't want to sing those songs at church. That's not what the rest of the churches are doing. I don't want to look weird. We just kind of settle. Yeah, God's word said that, but you don't really have to preach on those verses. You know what I mean? Like you preach out a song. Preacher. They settled. And from another perspective, look how far this nation has come. They went from being slaves to having slaves. Just serious. They went from being, everything they owned went to Pharaoh. Now they've got all these ites paying them money. You know what you would call that? Progress. Let's just be happy with that, right? That's progress. You went from being a slave nation, now you got all these other slaves. You got all these people serving you. You served Pharaoh for 400-something years. Then he was just this gypsy vagabond nation, run around the wilderness for 40 years. Crazy people. Now you've got all these people paying you money. Wow. That's progress. And from a human standpoint, you're right. And who in the world could ever be disappointed with such a kind of progress? Well, God. Look in chapter 2, verse 2. He said, "You shall make no league with the inhabitants of this land." You know what becoming tributary is? Making a league. You've made a deal. You've negotiated. You've made a deal. This land, ye shall throw down their altars, but ye have not obeyed my voice. Why have ye done this? He said, you've disobeyed. You call it progress. I'm calling it disobedience. You call it a job well done. I'm calling it sin. So these were not just scheduled, specific, and settled. They were sinful. They were sinful. Look in verse 21, chapter 2 and verse 21. He said, I also, this is God talking, I also will not henceforth drive out any from before them of the nations which Joshua left when he died. that through them I may prove Israel whether they will keep the way of the Lord, walk therein as their fathers did keep it, or not. Therefore the Lord left those nations without driving them out hastily, neither delivered He them into the hand of Joshua. God said, you call this progress, and you're happy about this, but I'm calling it sin. And God called it disobedience. You know what another Bible word for disobedience is? Rebellion. Rebellion. God was disappointed with the nation of Niethers. And as we survey our own church, are you really living in victory? I didn't ask, are you saved? But are you living in victory? How many Niethers do you have in the closet? In the book of the Revelation, God was talking about those believers that went to heaven that conquered sin. Now, how many of you know that when you're a sinner and you get saved, that you don't stop sinning? How many of you know that? Like, you're going to sin until you die. But how many of you can get victory over some sin? God said He would give them a white stone, a victor's stone. I wonder how many in this room will get one of those white stones. Or I wonder if we will stand and watch as God does not give us a white stone. And He looks at the stone and He looks at you and says, well, yeah, you're here, but you neithered. You neithered. You neithered. You could not. You just did not. And you did not. And He just puts all those white stones back in His little white stone box. I mean, you're in heaven. Thank God. The old songwriter said, too bad for heaven and too good for hell. I mean, yeah, you got there, but not with a lot of victory. These were sinful. And God called this sin. He called it disobedience. Look with me. Verse 3. In verse 2 He said, why have you done this? Wherefore I also said, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall be as thorns in your sides, and their God shall be a what? Snare unto you. God didn't call it disobedience. God said this is dangerous. He said this is going to be a snare unto you. And as we already read in verse number 11 and 12, these people started to forsake the Lord, and they started following the gods of the people around them. And by verse 13, the Bible says they forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth. I don't encourage you to look those up and study those things. It was very demonic, very just grotesque devil worship, sickening. Most of the stuff that the deep politics are into, but I'm just saying, just real deep devil worship stuff. God said, all this started because of these Niethers. I told you to get rid of these people. I told you to get that beat. Because what you don't realize is this is going to be a snare for you. This is going to mess you up. And you are going to leave me and you are going to fall into all sorts of gross, grotesque sin. And I know none of us believe it at the beginning, but that's where it always ends. And He said, this was dangerous. And you have chosen a dangerous way to live. He said, they shall be as thorns in your sides, and their gods. So He's not play that. God ain't a racist, ain't never been a racist. Ain't never gonna be a racist. You want to argue, we'll argue about it, but not right now, I'm busy. He said their gods are going to be a snare unto you. Do you know what a god was in the Old Testament? A spirit. He said, you don't understand. You can't handle the spiritual warfare that you're settling to live around. Go all the way back to the book of Genesis where Lot said, I'm going to go to Sodom. That seems like a good idea. What happened in Sodom and Gomorrah? Lot lost the spiritual warfare. That's what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. He lost. He lost the spiritual battle. Just like all these Israelites lost the spiritual battle. Those gods were a snare unto them. Is this making sense? And what God's perspective and our perspective is not normally the same. And it's usually best to just go with God's perspective. Brother William used to say all the time, it's not good to argue with God because He's usually right. And God said, you don't understand. You can't handle this spiritual war. You can't handle the temptation. So in the New Testament, when Jesus was teaching the boys how to pray, He said, lead us not into temptation. Not keep me from sin, keep me from the temptation. He said, why have you done this? And the judgment seat of Christ, I'm afraid, is not going to be as fun as what most people think. I'm sure there will be that overwhelming moment of awe and grandeur and worship where we get to the presence of Christ, and that's going to happen. But there's going to be a why have you done this? And you'll notice Israel, look at Israel's response. Look how they answered Him. Verse 4. The Lord spake these words that the people lifted up their voice and wept. And nothing to say but weep. A lot like Simon Peter when he denied Jesus 3 times. Bitterly. Had nothing else to say. These sinful things. And so in where we ended up in chapter 2 at the very end, God said that He left these things there in verse 22. These nations, these Niethers, that through them I may prove Israel. They'll keep the way as their fathers did, keep it or not. You know what these Niethers turned out to be? They turned out to just be proof of what Israel really was. They turned out to be just proof of what Israel really was. It proved it to God, and it proved it to Israel, and it proved it to whoever they lost to. It become just an outward billboard of what they were. Ain't that what sin does to us? Be sure your sin will find you out. And it's just a proof. It's a proof of where you're at. Now, Psalms chapter number 26. Look at there, I got one of them sweet Psalms in there. How about that? Psalms 26, bonus. Psalms 26:1. I'm almost done, I promise. Judge me, O Lord. Ugh. I bet none of us have prayed that this week. Judge me, O Lord, for I have walked in mine integrity. I have trusted also in the Lord, therefore I shall not slide. Here we go, verse 2. Looking at it? Examine me, O Lord, and say the word, prove me. Try my reins. God took these nations, this nation of Niethers, and all of these victories in their life, by them. We read in the book of Acts and in Corinthians that all of these things in the Old Testament, this nation of Israel, this church in the wilderness, and all of this stuff was for our example. It's for our learning and for our admonition. Is that right? And so I want you to see that how God measured them was by their Niether. He measured them by their Niethers. So God's measuring us by our Niethers. He's measuring us by these by these victories or these ties. God told him, He said, this is going to be a snare to you, because when God's people tolerate, they real soon start to participate. When God's people tolerate, they really soon start to participate. Had a teacher in college, he was very fond of making this statement, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth. And he said, our utterances and our tolerances come from the heart. See, a lot of what the church tolerated in the 60s, they're proud of now. You go back and listen to Vance Havner preaching to the Southern Baptists in the 60s. Go pull his tapes up. And listen how he blisters them for what is normal, what we call old-fashioned church now. I'm telling you the truth. Wherever the Southern Baptist Convention is, in 30 years, the Independent Baptists will be right there. Whatever God's people tolerate, they soon start to participate. So in your life, we're not discuss Southern Baptist Convention and all that. You're going to be doing it. I don't want to eat crow because I'm a young preacher and I've got young children. Brother Lee, he's not young anymore. Pops Collins back there. Pops Collins back there sitting. Look, he's in the recliner too. But he can say amen to this. And some of you have watched it too. You'll watch somebody, they'll be against sin the whole time their kids are young. But when those kids become teenagers, they tolerate it. Then by the time those kids are adults and married, now they're all just out there doing it. I know I sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but I'm telling you that God's the honest truth. What God's people tolerate, they soon participate. I can take you to people that are so far out of church right now. And you know where it started? It started with listening to worldly music. It started with country music, the South's idol. And I know that's, preacher, you're just being dead serious. I'm being honest with you, because what God's people tolerate, they'll soon participate. You cannot listen to 1,000 songs that glorify adultery and drinking and not eventually start committing adultery and start drinking. What do you expect is going to happen? You can't pump that stuff in your children and be like, what are you doing? Where did you get this from? I don't know where it's come, preacher. Kick the radio out the truck and we'll get somewhere. Rip the TV off the wall if that's where it's coming from. And, you can keep the TV because you can do all sorts of stuff with the TV. You don't have to just get rid of whatever's getting into it. Cut it off. Get it out. Because it's going to come out of life eventually. What we tolerate, we'll start participating. It's a slide. And these they prove where we stand with God. Because these people that they failed to get rid of hated God. Hated God with a passion. They mocked God. When they got to Jericho, old Rahab said they were afraid of him. Said that their hearts were melted. Y'all remember that? They knew something was up. They didn't like the God of Israel. They were God's enemies before they were Israel's enemies. What in the world is Israel doing? Making leagues with God's enemies. What in the world is the church doing today, making leagues with the enemies of God? What kind of neithers are in your life? If God was going to read through the list of names, would He put a neither next to yours? Would He put a neither next to your name and say, I mean, yeah, he's faithful to church, but I have to put the neither on that whole money part because he just never could give it up to me. He just never could make himself tithe. He never could get off that wallet. And I mean, yes, she comes to church and she's saved, but I'll have to put a neither next to that tongue because she just couldn't stop gossiping. Or I'm going to put a neither next to that pride because they could just never get themselves humble. I don't think I have to elaborate any more than neithers. I think y'all understand what I'm saying. And I'm sure you're ready for me to be done saying. Calvary, I love you, and I want us to walk into as much victory as we can walk in. I don't want to drag a bunch of neithers along with us. I don't mean, let me rephrase that because that kind of sounded hateful. I don't want us to have neithers in our lives is what I mean. Is that better? Does that make, okay. A nation of neithers. The entire team last week was so upset that all they got was a tie. Because you know what? Tournament starts next week. And you know how they decide where you're at in the tournament? By how many wins and losses you have. And you know what they do with ties? Nothing. Ties don't count. They don't count ties. They count wins and they count losses. When we get to the judgment seat of Christ, I don't know if ties are going to count. So let us lay aside the sin which doth so easily beset us. Let us run. Let's run this race and lay aside the weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us. Now, let's not be a nation of neithers. And let's stand on our feet. Miss Reed, can you come? I don't want to have unconfessed sin or unconquered sin in my life. If you can do God. Many have already started to come. I encourage you to do the same. There's not a soul in here that doesn't struggle with sin. Every head bowed, every eye closed. There's not a soul in here that doesn't struggle with sin. There's not no one in this room that doesn't have a neither somewhere that they need the power of God to help beat. The altar is open. You come.